Let's kick off our list with a doozy, Imperial Japan. The Japanese military regime killed around 8 million people on its mission to become the supreme Asian state. In December of 1937, the Japanese Imperial Army marched into China's then capital of Nanking and slaughtered 300,000 out of 600,000 civilians. That's half the population eliminated in one go. An estimated 80,000 women, as old as 70, were dragged off and forcibly subjected to coitus by groups of Japanese soldiers. They were then impaled to death with bayonets so they couldn't testify about the attacks. Generals encouraged young Japanese soldiers to inflict as much pain as possible on their captives. Victims were soaked in gasoline and then burned alive for the fun of it. Japan's secret biochemical warfare research center, Unit 731, killed 3,000 people with lethal human experimentation. There's not enough time today to list half of what they did, but here's an idea. Dissections of living young humans, pregnant women, without anesthesia, usually after they had been deliberately exposed and left to suffer from horrible diseases, chemical and biological weapons, and so forth and so on. There's also freezing the limbs off of victims, horror movie sadistic surgeries involving cutting off limbs and attaching them to the wrong sides of a victim, or removing organs and connecting the tubes back together without the organs to see what would happen, such as running the esophagus straight to the intestines with no stomach in between. Other experiments saw people locked out in pressure chambers until their eyes popped out, and others having their limbs frozen and then thawed out in red-hot water. So all of the human experimentation by this unit during the mass extinction event of the 30s and 40s was committed primarily against innocent Chinese civilians. Look, nothing I've ever heard of in my life, including in fiction, is darker than the horrors committed for years by this faction. Not to mention that the victims were just routinely tormented for the fun of it, without even the flimsy excuse of science being conducted. Like, this makes Mengele look like a misunderstood humanitarian. Alright, we'll go further back in history for this next group, the Mongol Empire. They slaughtered 11% of the world's population, so around 40 million people, to build an empire that covered nearly a quarter of the Earth's surface. Started by Genghis Khan, their army was a well-organized killing machine and used brutal war tactics to subdue largely populated cities. If the city complied with their wishes, they'd be spared, allowed to live, but if they didn't, game over for the city and everybody inside. And when the Mongol army plundered the, let's see if I got this right folks, Khwarezmid Empire in Persia, they punished rebels by pouring molten silver into their eyes for challenging the invasion. They may have even created biowarfare, as historians have traced the deadly Black Death panini of the Middle Ages to the siege of Kaffa. The Mongols weaponized the newly found bubonic ickiness by catapulting diseased corpses over city walls, infecting entire populations. So, next time you curse out a plague, we all know who to blame. Another swell group from the history, the Celts. In the ancient world, they ruled most of modern-day France, Belgium, and England. Even Rome had a tremendously hard time conquering them. Why? Well, they were incredibly fierce and also kind of bleep bleep crazy. In battle, they'd fight completely nude to show you that they weren't afraid to die, and if they won a battle, they'd cut off all the heads of their kills, take them home, and show them off like trophies. Gee, I wonder what museum has those now. Hey Mysterion, do you have one in your closet? To the shock and surprise of nobody, time to talk about the Viking Empire. Starting in 793 AD, the Viking Empire of the Scandinavian Peninsula started to pillage and plunder surrounding countries such as England, the Frankish Empire, Spain, and Russia. Their tactics were kind of brutal. They'd raid unprotected villages, killing and forcibly having intercourse with the residents, and stealing all goods before local defense units could stop them. That's if they could in the first place. As time went on, they became increasingly good at this and grew more brazen in their attempts to raid surrounding areas. It only lasted so long, however, and better defenses against their tactics made surprise raids a little more difficult. By 1086 AD, the Viking Empire kinda lost steam when the Norwegian king, Harald Hardrada, was defeated by the English at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. But still bad things. What if we were to chat about the Maori Civilization next? So this was the local tribe in New Zealand, and they were brutal warriors, people eaters, slave traders, and hunters. So just a lot of bad things. Their reputation was so fierce that even British colonists, who were also quite brutal, didn't like to go near them. When a specific colonist, James Cook, when he got there, things were okay at first. But then one of his men, James Rowe, angered the locals, and they ate him and his men. Look, I'm not gonna say that I'm pro-colonizing anytime soon, because I'm not, but I feel like consuming people's flesh seems a little extreme and probably not tasty. These guys were probably very, very skinny, no meat. Once the Maori got a hold of muskets, things got even worse. Tribal warfare broke out and some 18,000 people were slaughtered. Warfare between the British and the Maori continued for years, increasing the horrific death count until this group was eventually conquered. Not saying I'm pro being conquered, but I'm pro not people eating. I know I've talked about these guys before, but you can't talk about evil groups in history without the Ottoman Empire. Stretching over 3 continents and lasting over 6 centuries, this was one of the most powerful empires in history at its height. But towards the end of its existence, it committed several notable atrocities. Let's see, in 1876, 8,000 Ottoman soldiers massacred the defenseless population of Batak in Bulgaria, beheading and burning alive at least 5,000 people. Between 1915 and 1918, the government slaughtered 1.5 million of the 2 million Armenians living in Turkey in an attempt to systematically exterminate non-Muslims from their homeland. That's almost everybody. During the genocide, the youngest generation and the elderly were sent on death marches throughout the Syrian desert. This covered hundreds of miles, and those marching were often naked, so they would perish from dehydration and the heat of the sun pretty quickly. To this day, the Turkish government denies the Armenian genocide, in which ruthless armies called butcher battalions allegedly drowned people. They also burned people alive and threw them off cliffs. Absolutely awful. China's worst dynasty was the Song Dynasty, which ruled southern China in the mid-5th century. Now, it's a different dynasty from the one from 960 to 1279, which was from the Unified Dynasty of China. There were a total of 8 emperors in the history of the dynasty, and all except for the 1st and 3rd emperor were incompetent or tyrants. The 2nd emperor didn't participate in state affairs since his inauguration, and focused on enjoying entertainment. During his reign, Luoyang and Zan, China's most important cities, whose names I probably just butchered, were conquered by the Northern Empire. He was deposed and killed by loyalists of the 1st emperor a year after he became emperor. Now the 4th guy killed his father and sat on the throne, and that's because his father, the 3rd, tried to hand down the throne to his 3rd son, not to this guy. So after becoming emperor, he focused only on luxury, and there were some suspicions that he had committed incestual acts habitually. The 5th emperor is the 3rd son of the 3rd emperor and the brother of the 4th emperor. I hope I got that right. So he saw his father killed by his brothers, and he thought the brothers were going to kill him. So, killed the brothers and the emperor and became emperor. He killed many other royal family members because he suffered from paranoia that somebody was going to kill him. Now his son, the 6th emperor, was even more corrupt. Upon his father's death, he destroyed the grave of his beloved cousin and stole expensive burial items. Not only did he damage his father's grave pretty seriously, he also neglected his mother's illness and caused her to die. He also coitus against will and imprisoned his father's sisters and committed a number of very serious coitus crimes. He too is killed by his subjects a year after he became emperor. Let's get to the 7th guy. He thought his position was at stake and again killed a lot of people. He was the cruelest though out of all the guys I've talked about today. He committed a number of killings in a way that was unacceptable even by moral standards of the time, which were apparently very low. He kind of just wiped out all the royal families except for those who defected abroad. So, good luck. Portugal's empire sought to spread Catholicism around the world and profit from agricultural and gold resources of others. My gauge here when it comes to Catholicism is no secret, but when there's evidence to support it, I can't help but make it known. So they expanded into South America, Africa, and Asia, and more than 5 million people died in the process. Widely considered to have introduced the transatlantic slave trade, Portugal exported more than 4.5 million people out of Africa, almost twice as many as any other colonial power. Most were, to no surprise, severely mistreated, and disobedient slaves were lashed, burned with hot wax, or forced to have coitus against their will. Meanwhile in India, Portugal established the Goa Inquisition, in which Hindus were burned at the stake and boiled alive with molten oil, all to convert people to Christianity. Look, I'm just saying if you're doing all of that to make people believe in your god, that's a little extreme. Or a lot extreme and unnecessary. In the 20th century, Portugal faced international pressure to release its African colonies, but refused to do so, and responded in the 1970s by massacring everybody. Thousands were executed and tormented, young girls were crucified on trees and had certain parts of their flesh cut off, men were castrated, and the youngest generation had their eyes gouged out. Alexander the Great is considered one of the greatest military geniuses in history, but the Macedonians in name tend to be feared. Alexander formed an army and began conquering Greece, Syria, Egypt, Persia, and went all the way to India. But his conquests were not without horrific and barbaric practices, or else I wouldn't be talking about him today. This included crucifying thousands, burning cities to the ground, and slaughtering thousands of innocent people. I swear, I haven't talked this much about crucifying since I was an altar server. And that's been a hot minute. Alexander was also a paranoid ruler who had many people put to death for fear that they might overthrow him. The Macedonian Empire died with him though. The Macedonian Empire indeed did die with him, and was then divided up into 3 separate countries. How about we end today with the Italian Empire? So in 1861, Italy became a unified country and hungered to colonize other parts of the world like their European neighbors. They quickly started colonies in African countries like Somalia and Libya, and in 1922, under the control of fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, Italy planned to end annex even more territories to control its power, including Greece and Albania. While in power, Mussolini created a police state, dissolved parliament, and suppressed all oppositions against him. Fascist Italy fought military campaigns, on the ground and in the air, in Libya and Eritrea in the 1920s, and in Ethiopia and Somalia after 1935. What is surprising is how nasty these campaigns were. In the Cyrenaica region of Libya, the Italians used forced marches, 16 bad camps, and massive population transfers in what some historians consider the first 20th century use of genocidal tactics outside of a world mass extinction event. In Eritrea, the deported leaders opposed to colonization and jailed their families and relatives. By the late 1930s, Mussolini and his lieutenants favored execution over deportation, and during the Ethiopian conflict in the late 1930s, Italian aircrafts exploded 12 Red Cross hospitals, violating international law. When the big mass extinction event that we associate with Yahtzees was over, Italians were shocked to learn that their government had used poison gas, and lots of it, again in violation of an international agreement. This one made in 1925. As the English-language newspaper revealed, others knew much earlier. The material was mustard gas, by the way, and its vapors were so deadly, and so were the drops that got into the skin, that they caused blisters and lethal lesions inside the body. Sneaky and lethal? Not a good combination.